Want to know if anyone would like to share something from your pair conversations or have a question for any of our panelists.
Hello.
Hi, sorry.
Hi. So y'all mentioned earlier about how the majority of your group is white, correct? Before, like, you went to YW and they pointed out that most of the women who were there were white.
So I would say the 3 women who went that day were all white women.
Okay.
And we are a more diverse group than showed up that day, so we are not all white women.
Okay.
We have some guys, we have some students of color.
Cool. Great. So we were just wondering, after that interaction with YW, how have y'all taken what you're talking about here and applied it to yourselves? And how are you going forward trying to be what you're talking about, I guess is the best way to phrase it.
So it's a great question. So actually,
Mike.
Thank you. Sorry. Great question, right? So are we walking the walk, right? So yeah, essentially. So we did a couple things. One is we connected with the American Evaluation Association, which is the national organization. They have a program called JEDI, which stands for Graduate Education Diversity Internship. And we applied to be a site to host a graduate diversity intern. And so we were selected and we hosted an intern from, actually from Western Mass, who was a woman of color, who was really interested in thinking about racial equity and evaluation. And so she was with us all fall. So that was one thing. I think the other thing is it made me think more strategically about who I bring to what meetings, right? So, I'll be honest, a lot of times who I bring to meetings depends on who's available at that moment, right? YW can meet at 2 p.m., who's available at 2 p.m.? And what that said to me is I have to be more thoughtful, right? And so we try to approach that differently now. Great, do you have anything here?
I have a question just in response to that.
Yeah.
I totally get that, I'm on board with that, but if you're in an organization that is a low diversity organization, I think there's also a burden to say, well, I need to make sure on this interview committee, for example, that we take the one person of color that we have in this group and the one woman that we have, and we're always going to make them go, because then that means that they're shouldering an undue burden of things that might not necessarily factor into measurable things.
So I absolutely in no way, so I do a ton of work in wearing other hats around this particular issue. When I mentor, I think universities really struggle with issues of tokenism, right?
Yeah.
And you can look at who's on what committee. I wasn't sort of getting into all those types of things.
Sure.
But absolutely. Yeah, I was just specifically talking about when you're building teams of students and faculty to partner with organizations to think more strategically about that.
Yeah, I get that. It's just also a concern.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Other people have, I think.
Yeah.
And so there was a question here and then here.
I think I understood you just say that you used your pre-survey to help design your intervention and your action plans. Is that right?
So we used the, can you repeat the question?
The results of your initial survey, were they just strictly put in a box as baseline data, or were they used to identify problems that the organization had in implementing, in creating diversity, and then you used that for your intervention? And then the second part is, then each of your 3-month stages, did you use that to find out where there were barriers or problems that you then change the action plan to make things move along more smoothly?
Yeah, so our surveys, I think has been a big effort from me and my team to make sure that they just don't go into a box and are not used. So the surveys is used in a couple ways. We do actually use it before we actually start the intervention to really identify, okay, what are things that are coming up in this survey that are challenges for the particular group or this particular organization. And our team really take those into account when they're interacting with the organization. Once we do the intervention, they also look at those results to really understand, okay, given what we're seeing in the data, what are some recommendations we can give this organization or where they might want to do the action plan. So it's sort of an effort, a combination of what the data is telling us and then what are the conversations with that organization is telling us and sort of bring all those pieces of information together.
Thank you. I appreciate the
heard you. Do you have a
So
thought?
the verified trust part, though, like framing it, I guess.
I can start.
Yeah, why don't you start, and then I have a thought.
So I think we were probably a little hard at some point, right? So I think, and even my own team, pushes me on the data, like what does this mean? Why this is the success indicator? Where is that coming from? So I think it's sort of, when it comes to data, building rapport with the folks also who are implementing these programs, and really building that trust of and that's what you also need to take into account when you're building data, when you're doing any data collection efforts or any research methods, to really include all sorts of folks in that conversation, because you will be surprised how much insight these folks can also have. And when it comes to, the literature is important, and sort of doing valid and reliable measures, but also sometimes you have to take a risk and say, the literature is not really talking about this, and we actually gonna, try to measure this. And this were also conversations that we needed to have at some point. A concrete example is that we had a sense, when we had some of the conversations, that behaviors were important. And they came up with a proposal that we just didn't feel that the tools were just not really what we were looking for. And there was not much that was out there in terms of the certain behaviors that we wanted to measure. So, we really asked back and said, we need something modified. This is just not really fulfilling our needs and the needs of some of the folks that are employed in the program. And we had to have that conversation of, some of the proposals here just doesn't work for us.
Yeah, so I have a sort of my experience with that. So my own background, I'm actually trained as a sociologist and a psychiatric epidemiologist. So most of my work is with folks with serious and persistent mental illness. And after doing that work, and I will say fairly successfully for a certain amount of time, I realized there was a lot about what I was doing that I was not finding meaningful, and learned a lot about CBPR, community-based participatory research, where you build on, you partner with communities and let them lead the research. They ask questions they want to ask. You acknowledge the lived experience and expertise of outside of academia. And so a big chunk of the work that we do at the Institute is on principles of CBPR. And when you do that, regardless of what your community is, it's all about checking your biases and expertise, right? That everyone who comes to the table brings a different set of expertise and building a way to have all of those be valued. So I think what we ended up doing is sort of taking our experience from CBPR with very different populations, refugee and immigrant population, and sort of saying, how do we take the lessons from that to building this partnership? So we were in no way the experts in the room around racial equity. We were methodologists in that room, right? I mean, that was what we were.
So we're just about to
Okay.
close to
Yeah.
transitions.
Yeah.
Okay, good. A last comment I would make on that is that I think that facilitative role that Elise is talking about, one surfaces the values among all of the people in the room, right? And that's where, when we think about the importance of the kind of work that we're talking about social justice and equity, the perspectives are going to be as diverse as the diversity we get in the room. Having that come out is itself really useful. And then questions of what do you do with that? How do you measure that? You get to go from there, right? But that's the beauty of it. So I think you want as much of a range as you can get there, and that's the goal. Yeah.
CBPR, community-based participatory research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot will come up if you Google that.
So I want to thank our three opening speakers, and we're going to transition to hearing from some leaders in the field to talk about practical implementations, and give them a round of applause. I'll invite our next group down, and so we are, I'll introduce our moderator, and then she'll kick things off. Sujan is principal of Diversity at Workplace Consulting Group and also an adjunct professor at Suffolk University, and don't hold that against her, and previously served as Vice President of Talent, Diversity, and Inclusion at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. And a couple mics there.
Thank you.
Good evening. she, her, and hers. And I would love to just pass the mic and have each of the folks here introduce themselves.
Sure. My name is Bonnard. I'm Director of Diversity for Goodwin, a global law firm based here in Boston. I work out of the New York office, so I made a special trip to be a part of this conversation. I've been in this space for over 15 years across several industries, from banking and finance, Big Four accounting, entertainment and media, and now law firms. I've been in this space for some time, so excited to be here.
Thank you. Good evening, folks. My name is Greg Simchinsky. I am the Title VI Specialist for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. I also provide support work around civil rights compliance issues for the MBTA as well, kind of a joint operation, so there's lots of issues to dive into there. I've been working in the transportation sector on civil rights issues exclusively for about a decade now. I bring to that a background in constitutional law and civil rights practice. So that's kind of the lens and perspective that I often kind of turn to when analyzing some of these issues. And certainly this idea of applying data and understanding new methodologies of analyzing data in a more nuanced way and bringing it to this sector, the transportation sector, and specifically the kind of civil rights obligations in the transportation sector really feature heavily in my daily activities. So I'm excited for the chance to speak with all of you here tonight.
All right, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists some questions, and I'm not going to go easy, I'm letting you know now. Because, of course, I had a little chance to talk to Greg, but I didn't have a chance to warn Bernard. So one of my pet peeves with panels is soft questions. And my other pet peeve with panels is we don't get down into the issue deep and wide. We sort of scratch the surface and we clap and we go home. So I'm hoping to really go deep today. So I'm going to ask.
Something happened with the mic, I think.
They didn't like what I said.
Okay, yeah, that's true. There we go. There we go. There we go.
They cut it when I said we're going to go wide and deep. Oh, now it's back. All right, great.
Conspiracy.
Conspiracy. I knew it. I knew it.
I'm just hoping that the two lawyers up here don't have to plead the fifth at any point, but we'll avoid that.
Well, I figured all these fine folks came out to spend some time with us today. Might as well get really down to it. So the topic is evidence-based and using data for equality. And mostly I would like to focus on within organizations. And mainly workforce as well, because that's such an important topic. So I have some questions, and then I'm going to ask some follow-up questions. First question is, I would like to start with you, Greg, and if Bernard, you can also answer, that would be great. Is what barriers have you faced in evidence-based diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and how have you overcome them?
Sure. So one of the things that I definitely wanted to kind of emphasize here tonight, it's a conversation around data, yet I don't think we should necessarily be elevating data to a kind of a mythical position because it's simply not. Data is often flawed, data is often old. The way that we interpret data may not be the most effective way or an accurate way, right? So just because we're basing our thoughts and our analyses and our anticipated path forward on some kind of data-driven underpinnings, let's not assume that it's infallible. And that's definitely been one of the barriers that I've faced in the work that I do, where something as simple as we might turn to empirical data sources like census data to try to get an understanding of the demographics. Let's say, from my perspective in the transportation sector, the demographics of a service area. It's an area where public transit is being provided. What are the demographics of that area, and how does that inform the kind of service decisions that we make? Are there language barrier issues that we might need to take on as an organization? What kind of accessibility issues and opportunities might there be given the demographics of the area that we're serving? So I would certainly kind of caution against this assumption that the empirical data sources are just automatically correct. If you're looking at something like census data, we're approaching that time right now where the last decennial census the data sets available through it are 10 years old at this point, right? That's not necessarily reflective of the communities that we live in, the communities that we serve. So we've certainly seen that in a very practical application in the transportation sector. We've seen in the Boston area, in Massachusetts, since the last census, we've seen refugee resettlements that aren't necessarily captured in census data. But we as civil rights practitioners advancing an equity agenda, an equity objective through the work that we do as an organization, it's on us to know those kinds of happenings, those kinds of trends, and understand that the data may not necessarily show it, but we know that it's happening, right? Another example, natural disaster, resettlements produced by natural disaster. We've seen both of these in Boston in large number, and in Massachusetts more broadly, even New England more broadly, over the last several years. And I consider that to be, a barrier, meaning it can be challenging to know how carefully to look at the data and how much to try to offset that with additional kind of anecdotal information from the community. But I also consider it an opportunity to say, we know that the data is only a starting point. Those kind of empirical data sources are a starting point. Let's make sure that we're really thinking critically about how we're using that data to make sure that we're being as effective as we can around this kind of civil rights objective.
No snaps? No, I totally agree. From an institutional, organizational perspective.
Mike, put it in your mouth.
There you go. All right.
Put it in your mouth.
From an institutional perspective, one of the things that we always have to be mindful of is data in and data out, right? And as we've become very focused on data, we have been very careful on how we start to track, start to mine that data. But what we also try to focus on to really address any issues around barriers is the qualitative stuff, right? How do you take the data, the empirical data, and really create the lived experience of the individuals within your institutions? Because a lot of us are either going to be attracted to this work because we want to drive the numbers, which is really misleading, or we want to drive cultural change, which are the experiences on a day-to-day basis that people feel different, lack of belonging, and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at the data, I challenge everyone to really think a little bit more broadly than just shooting for the numbers. We want to benchmark, but if you're looking at certain sectors, tech or the legal industry, where the numbers just don't always look that great for us, then sometimes we're lowballing us. But it's also an opportunity to say, well, what does the pipeline look like? What do we need to do as an industry? What can we do as an organization to pull our peer organizations forward to drive change? So it's all how we want to use it and what is the why. Why are we really attacking this conversation? And what is the value imperative for your respective organization, for you at the individual level, and then from a cultural perspective? So many uses, but I challenge people to look beyond just the numbers. Don't let the numbers fool you. It's always a cultural conversation.
Thank you for that. So let's go a little deeper. A common phrase that I hear is, we want to be the same demographic as our community, reflect the community that we serve. How realistic is that? And is there any flaw in that kind of statement?
Can I say yes and?
Yes, and?
Yes and. There could be flaws. So we were talking earlier, if I'm looking at Boston and we're trying to attract more racial and ethnic diverse attorneys to the marketplace, there's a challenge, right? Yes, we have a ton of schools, but a lot of people leave the city. So, to reflect the marketplace, we have to figure out how to retain those individuals. But again, it's not real. Sometimes it may be unrealistic to say you want to reflect that marketplace because you may not be building that talent pipeline. And if you're looking at this city, or if you're looking at, San Francisco or any other city or markets where there is a truly imbalance of the talent and actual representation of the marketplace, regardless of sector, sometimes it's challenging, it's unrealistic. So we have to think, what do we want to invest in importing talent in and growing it? But those organizations have to be committed to, when they bring folks in, they're investing in developing and nurturing and doing the right thing so there's stickiness. Yes, we want to reflect the marketplace, but there are some headwinds in doing that.
So here's my concern with strictly looking at, the numbers exercise of, are we seeing parity in the percentages across demographics in the available workforce and an organization's workforce, or in people that we're serving as a kind of a public-facing organization, what have you. It puts the focus on the outcome, which is important, of course, but I think there's an opportunity for having a meaningful, sustained dialogue earlier in the process around the opportunities that are leading to that particular outcome that you're seeing in the data, or that you're maybe trying to achieve as an organization working on its kind of diversity profile. I think that just focusing on the outcomes without looking at the kind of matrix of opportunities across different demographics that shaped those outcomes, it's a missed opportunity. So that's certainly one of the things that I'm always trying to push at MassDOT and the MBTA is, okay, we know what the outcomes are. We know that the outcomes might be labeled good or bad, challenging or not. There might be some way to characterize those outcomes. But what kind of opportunities existed to encourage an equitable outcome from the very beginning? And sometimes it's a matter of looking, just at the organization itself and the kind of outcomes that we have direct, influence and control over. Sometimes it's even a matter of thinking a little bit more broadly about the way that a transportation provider is intertwined with public education, with public health, with local government. It's not necessarily an island unto itself. What kind of opportunities did or did not exist to strive for that kind of equity profile of an organization? So it's not to say that emphasizing the numbers that you see from kind of an outcome analysis is a negative. It shouldn't be considered negative. It's a positive part of the process. But I think there's also this earlier conversation, this analysis of outcomes, of opportunities, that is really critical as well.
Can I add one point?
Yes, please.
I do want to just add, one of the things about benchmarking, it gives us a destination
Yes.
at times. And I think when we do this work, sometimes we're doing it because it's good, we need to do it, it's the right thing to do. But if we don't have a destination where we're going, we're just going to be chasing our tails, right? And we want to figure out how to measure it, which we spoke about earlier. And we want to figure out where we want to really make the shift and how do we move that needle. So there's some value of having some targets, some numbers which you want to measure your efforts towards.
Absolutely. So let's go down a little deeper.
Oh, no.
For every organization that tells me they can't find diverse talent, I have diverse talent coming to me saying they don't have opportunities. Something is flawed with this math. And people say, yes, maybe the bottom line isn't the outcome and the numbers, but it certainly helps. And people say what's measured is what gets done. So I want to get into the topic of quotas. Quotas. How do you guys feel about that? What are the pros and cons of quotas for equity?
So I already alluded to the fact that my kind of academic background is in the law, and specifically in constitutional law and civil rights practice. So I can't help but be informed by that kind of perspective, and certainly the kind of state of the industry from that perspective would be that any efforts around equal opportunity, around affirmative action, around organizations trying to achieve diverse workplaces, it's not a matter of trying to fill a quota. The objective is not to set or fill or try to achieve a quota. That's not what the law is expecting, that's not what the law is calling for, and that's not how any of these efforts are meant to be structured. It's a question of setting goals that we believe are, realistic goals based on the availability in the workforce and so on, and trying to, as an organization, produce the kind of, cultural change within the organization that helps to strive to achieve those goals. But I think one of the best kind of scenarios that I've experienced that really demonstrates how quotas can be kind of a challenging concept for employees at any organization comes up in the kind of hiring context where I'm consulted on decisions around hiring, and I'll often be communicating with hiring committees. Well, they'll say where they will say, we've narrowed it down to 2 finalists. As far as we can see, they're completely evenly matched, evenly qualified, the same kind of background, same experience level, same credentials. They performed equally well in interviews. They're equally matched. But one of them can be considered, a diverse candidate from our affirmative action plan, and the other one isn't. So we, as the hiring committee, feel that's the appropriate kind of tiebreaker. We'll go with the quote-unquote diverse candidate, not the non-diverse candidate. And I always have to kind of caution them at that point to say, that's not really how the law in this area is structured to work, and that's not really what the objective is meant to be. If anything, the fact that you've reached this kind of, this stalemate, this impasse of completely equal, it puts the objective, the onus on the organization to try to dig deeper about these candidates, to try to figure out what it is about these candidates that could set them apart, aside from something like race or ethnicity or disability or gender or what have you. So it's really about taking a deeper dive as an organization to understand the kind of value added of each of these candidates from the perspective of factors not based on the an individual's demographic category that they might self-identify with, and really try to make the decision on what those kind of neutral objective factors that aren't based on demographics. And it's a tricky nuance to understand that we are trying to achieve a diverse workforce. We're setting goals for ourselves to try to achieve diversity in the workplace, but at the same time, we're not looking at those kinds of factors as the make or break decider between one candidate or another. It's meant to inform the decision. It's not meant to be the decision. So, any additional thoughts?
I mean, I'll underscore that totally, but I think the other piece behind it is really challenging the organizations to dig deep and get out and find the talent in the marketplace and beyond, and really holding your recruiters or your talent acquisition folks, whoever, accountable for really pulling together a really strong, talented pool of individuals. What I've observed and what we know now is recruiting is very passive, right? You're interested in an opportunity, you get online, you upload your resume, you write a nice little paragraph, you may share a photo or a video, and hope something gets picked up, right? So there's a lot of things that are missed because we're looking at the numbers, and some organizations are really tasking their recruiting folks to really get out in the marketplace, develop relationships, become the brand and the go-to person. Even if that company is not the right organization for you, you have someone who can help you get your foot in the door at another organization for which they know is probably the right organization for you based on what your skill set is or what your interests are, right? That is the piece. Driving quotas is not going to get the change, because we can bring in a ton of people into an organization regardless of the box you check, but if the culture is not there for you, you won't succeed. And that's unfair. It's unfair to you and it's unfair to our organization. We don't need to force something. We need to make sure that we are really getting people assigned and aligned with the right organization so that they can have a flourishing career. That is the end game.
Thank you. So let's get a little deeper. If we all agree that there has been inequity in our society, do we all agree on that?
I think we can use that as a starting point, yeah.
Thank you. Very controversial. If that is a known fact, and we all know opportunities, and thus now we have to evaluate them equally. If there was not equality before, there is no equity now, so this whole concept of best qualified for the job becomes a really set up to fail syndrome. So I would love to hear some of your thoughts on that, of how do you rectify, you're saying there has been inequality, and no equity, and yet you expect them to come just as polished and poised and skilled and networked like everybody else who's had that equality. Help us with that one.
Yeah, sure. No, that's great. And again, from my perspective, that obligation falls to the organization. And you know, I certainly had some notes jotted down about this idea of you know, holding the hiring process accountable for its actions, holding, you know, an HR representative that's part of a hiring committee accountable for their actions, and how can you do that as, you know, part of the hiring committee? I think that some of the, you know, kind of solutions or ideas that I had jotted down also get to this idea of, we know that we're not dealing with an equitable society. We know that we're dealing with a society where inequities have a lasting impact, have a today impact on all of our lives. So something as simple, and this can be, you know, at any level of an organization, as long as you're you know, part of the hiring process in some way. A simple question like, to the HR office, show me how this job was posted. Where did this job, how was it disseminated? How were people put on notice about the availability of this opportunity? I assume that there's, you know, an email list. There might be some partner organizations that were then asked, you know, here's a job offer. Can you send this out to your networks? What do the, you know, diversity profiles look like of that distribution network? And if we know that it's not reaching people, or if we know that it's you know, skewed towards some groups and not others, then you're absolutely right. We're expecting an equitable outcome from an inequitable start. It doesn't work that way. Another one, we see this all the time in the concept of, you know, kind of standardized testing. This idea of, you know, are we building in inequities into the way that we're communicating information? There's some concepts that might be clear to one person of one particular demographic group that's a concept that's foreign to another person of a different demographic group. And if we were to, you know, announce a job opportunity using that kind of terminology, well, somebody's got, you know, a better shot simply because they understand the lingo, they understand the terminology, they have the kind of cultural, linguistic background that lets them understand exactly what it is that hiring committee is looking for, what that job is about, right? So looking critically at the way that you're communicating information, not only who's the information reaching, but how are you saying the things you're saying? And what could you do to be a little bit more either, you know, universal in the way that you're communicating, or understand that there might be different ways to present these concepts based on the communities that you're trying to reach. And I think that all of those are kind of practical ways to help to not only acknowledge the fact that there is this reality that we're dealing with around inequity, but to try to take active steps to overcome it, to address it.
Let me add to that. There are a couple other steps I think we can add to that list. For those organizations with hiring committees and panels and so on and so forth, individuals outside of the designated HR roles can act as what we call disruptors, right? So it can be someone who's also in the line of business, and their role is actually to challenge everyone's thinking around the candidate pool. Really questioning, really pushing them, so that if there is an impasse, like, how do you dig a little bit deeper? Another question I think I like to challenge folks on, and we all hear this, right? Wasn't a fit. Wasn't a fit, right? There's never a fit, right? So the question is, what is this individuals, or what are these individuals bringing to the table that's additive to the team? We don't want to hear the conversation, well, you know, I can always go to the bar and have a drink with this person. I can see us doing X, Y, and Z. This is about getting the job done. This it's about the task and really being effective and efficient. So let's think about what is different that this person is bringing to the table. Yes, they both have the same degrees. They may have gone to different institutions. One is pedigree, one is not. But one has grit, one doesn't, right? What are those values are to us in our culture, in our organization? Those are some things to really, truly think about, because you start to kind of peel back the layers and you challenge people's thinking on what do you want on the team? Because if you want a mini-me, your team is not going to move but any further than where it is. You may think you're winning, but at some point, your team will start to lose, right? And that's the diversity of thought, diversity of whatever lens you want to put on it. But there are other approaches that you can put in place to challenge the status quo. In organizations, we're doing it, standardized interviews where everyone's asked the same question, so you don't get buddy-buddy to figure out, oh, you went to school with so-and-so, do you know, whatever the case may be. And now you have a different relationship and you like this person, so you really champion them. So there are ways to disrupt that process, but I think the biggest piece, before we even get there, is what we were talking about earlier, is the talent pool. And really, like, even how our job postings written, are they attractive to across genders and across race and gender, ethnicity, whatever the case may be. But how do we really elevate the profiles of the opportunities that do exist, and that people are really responding to the right roles that are the right roles for them, right? Because of the passive recruiting process, you have hundreds of resumes coming in for roles for which people really are not, it's not the right job for them, right? So everyone's hungry for the next thing. How do we really have this really candid conversation about getting yourself in line, ready for that role, ready for that opportunity, and maybe that's a 5-year opportunity away, and you need to look at something a little bit more junior, whatever the case may be. But there's a lot that's there. I think the biggest piece, again, let's not get caught up with the recruiting piece sometimes. It's, you gotta fix the house. All of us are in a family, all of us are in relationships. You gotta fix what's going on inside the organizations, because then things start to change outside.
Thank you. So I think the takeaway there is it's no longer about cultural fit, it's about cultural add. Cultural fit was 20 years ago. Cultural add is now. So let's go a little deeper. So statistically, studies have shown that about 20 years ago, society as a whole, or people in the workplace, actually liked the concept of diversity and inclusion. Recently, studies have shown that white Caucasian workers actually have negative thoughts about diversity and inclusion. In fact, it's seen as almost a zero-sum game. You're taking my spot. So with that statistic in mind, talk to me about the concept of reverse discrimination, because that comes up a lot. So I would love to hear you guys. If I may, can I start with Bernard first, since I feel like Greg always starts.
He's been taking the mic, but okay. Reverse discrimination. I'm going to start that I really can't see, I understand that there's an assumption around reverse discrimination. I'm going to take it a step back. I think and I feel and observed in my time in this space that people have never really truly been invited to the table to have the conversations about their role around diversity and inclusion, right? Our straight white men have been carrying the burden as if it's always their fault. Never really part of the conversation to come up with a solution on how do you drive change. So your natural reaction to the conversation will always be, I'm gonna lose. And so I think there's a real opportunity today, and you're starting to see organizations do it, inviting everyone to the table to talk about their role in diversity and inclusion, where you really add value, And you may have a dimension about you that you cover for, right? You may have a disability, you may be a parent, you sneak off, say you're going to a client meeting, but you're really going to see your kids play a game, right? All these things that I think people start to cover now becomes a defense mechanism to call out, it's a losing situation. So I think that's the starting point. And we need to get real about that. Whether you want to kick off an ally program or conversation, or whether you want to have a conversation around race, or you want to have a reverse mentoring program to understand the new generation, whatever that is, we need to at least start there. And then we can use the data and all this other stuff to kind of bring to life what are the systemic problems, for which if you're a person of influence empowering your organization or your department or your team, you can now create processes and policies to try to drive change, right? The whole thing about this conversation is that people have been at it for so long and sometimes don't see the change. So they're tired, right? It's like going to the gym week after week, hoping to lose the pounds, and you turn around and it's the same thing, right? And you get fatigued. And so how do we really kind of change the concept of reverse discrimination? Have you joined the party? Have you joined the conversation? Have you actually look inside and identify, as the gentleman said earlier, your biases, your triggers, what makes you uncomfortable? Also, have you engaged in a conversation? What is your experience being X at this organization? My experience is Y. Why are our experiences different, right? Let's somewhat open the can of worms. It's uncomfortable, and it will be. But the reality, once we start there, I think the reverse discrimination conversation will start to go away. And I think the root is you weren't invited to start with, or if you go to those classic diversity trainings from the late 90s, early 2000s, where people walked out really traumatized.
They call it guilt sessions.
Yes.
Right.
So I point all those out, not to skirt the question, but I always try to look beneath the surface as to why people feel a certain way before we jump to trying to defend a response.
So I would just add that I'm really encouraged by the fact that the thinking in this area in particular seems to be one of those areas where we're seeing kind of innovative new thoughts coming to bear. I think where the terminology around reverse discrimination used to be an emphasis for some of the practitioners in this area, and certainly for some of the people impacted by hiring processes. Now we're starting to see a conversation that's shifting a little bit towards, rather than just reverse discrimination, we're starting to talk about privilege. And what I'm kind of excited to see developments around is, how does this conversation around what used to be reverse discrimination, or this kind of concern about reverse discrimination, turn into a conversation around opportunities afforded by an acknowledgement of privilege, and people, employees of organizations, applicants of organizations, on all sides, trying to understand how to be proactive in the use of any privilege that they may or may not possess, have experienced, to further that kind of equity objective of an organization. I think we're really starting to see some intriguing thoughts around if we're acknowledging that privilege exists, how can we use that as a tool to advance an equity objective rather than just consider it to be an obstacle or kind of the negative side of acknowledging inequities in our society. And I'm not saying that I have all the answers there. I think that it's kind of an evolving field of thought that I'm personally, as a practitioner in this area, very excited to see how that plays out.
Thank you. It actually reminds me of a question I heard on NPR, and actually it's a topic that we discussed in Lead Boston with YWCA, which is the question, can there be reverse racism? And I see some heads already turning certain ways. The reason why there can't be If you don't have the power, the discrimination can't go very far. That is why there can be reverse racism. So I just wanted to bring that up. Let's go deeper. So these folks finally came into the organization. We've been doing all the hiring, the sourcing, we looked for cultural ads, we searched far and wide, we addressed the concept of reverse discrimination. Now people are inside. People are inside. Now, women are very much coached and mentored to act like a man. People of color are very much coached and mentored to act like a non-person of color. And in that gap, it creates all sorts of phenomena such as imposter syndrome, lack of feeling like yourself, lack of authenticity, and yet in every company there's a big banner that says, be your authentic self. And yet, in order to be successful, you have to act, talk, speak, do emails like the majority that's already in the organization. So again, help me here. Because if you are being coached to act like the majority, how can you possibly be successful?
Did you just drop the mic? I just lost my train of thought.
Sorry. Help us. How do you?
Again, I'm gonna start from a different point of view. I think the first place, and I know that organizations are exploring this and having conversations around what is leadership? What is the exemplar of an individual who is performing at the highest level? And really redefining that. So that means across gender, across race, ethnicity, cultural backgrounds, class, whatever the case may be. I think that's one of a starting point. And I think that in organizations, there are individuals who are the stars, but at some point early in their career, people doubted their capabilities and skills. And now there are examples that leadership doesn't have to look like you, talk like you, walk like you. But we also have to remind ourselves that we're trying to shift a system, and it takes time to shift the system. And I'm not saying it's not happening or it is in certain organizations, whatever the case may be. But there's both a systemic change where we really need to call out folks to say, why is this individual not being put up for promotion? Why is she considered, a 2-rated individual based on asking a lot of questions in a meeting? She's not aggressive, she's just being assertive. Really challenging people in those rooms when those conversations are taking place to think a little bit more broadly. When that starts to happen, and it is happening, and I've been in a lot of talent review meetings where people are being pushed and challenged because you tend to forget what your blind spots are and what you qualify as that next level leader to really kind of redefine what that script looks like. So that's, one. Two, yes, you come into the organization, just like any team, there is a uniform. There is a language in the organization. It is. It's if I were to come to your house, it's probably the way we speak, and that's accepted, right? If I come over for Thanksgiving, by the time I leave, I'm like a family member, right? So we got to also understand that we have to have that cultural agility to be flexible, because that is real, and we're human, and we're always going to. There are norms and behaviors that we're expecting of individuals that align with that. There's going to be variance along those lines, but there are norms. So I start there just because if we start redefining it, it makes it easier for us to react when we do see difference in a positive light, because we know that we are looking for that additive, and that person is actually bringing something we've never seen before. And those that really make it at times, you've never seen before, because you've never invited them into the organization. So that's the first step.
I think the only thing that I could add to that would be, from my perspective as a civil rights practitioner operating within an organization that is expected to rise to the challenge of meeting these objectives, but isn't always necessarily on the trajectory organically to do it, it takes, be relentless. This is a civil rights fight. This is part of the civil rights movement. This is, the ongoing struggle. It's happening in real time. This isn't past, this is now, this is future. And yes, there's the reality of living your daily life and some compromises that people might have to make to simply make ends meet by taking a job that's available to them. And it doesn't mean that every action can necessarily be carrying the torch in advancing the cause. But there is a way to continue to be relentless on these issues in the situations you find yourself in. There is a way to communicate with your coworkers, to communicate with management, senior leadership at your organizations around the importance of striving for these objectives in tangible, practical ways. Even if it means it's not the most popular voice, or the most successful voice necessarily in the organization. It's not always necessarily the rocket ship to the top. To be holding these organizations accountable for their civil rights obligations. But the fight needs to happen. We need to be relentless in the fight. That's all I would add.
Thank you. I realize I gave away my mind. Thank you. So I know that we want to have some questions from the group. So one last question I want to ask each of you at this time, which is the concept of the right thing to do. Greg, you talked about the fight, be relentless. So what other reasons are there other than being the right thing to do? Because right thing to do is a great rally cry, but not a guarantee of change of behavior. I know the right thing to eat all the time doesn't mean I do it all the time. And so aside from the right thing to do, what are some benefits, real tangible benefits that organizations could reap from diversity and inclusion efforts?
The easiest space to start is innovation. Different points of view, different thoughts, leveraging different experiences. That's the win. In this day and age where we're competing for eyeballs on the screen or on your phone, where we're competing for how many shoppers are coming in your store or coming to your site, you really have to figure out how you can be nimble and how to be good in whatever sector you're in. And the only way to do that, one of the best ways, is really leveraging the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience, bringing that talent into your organization and really tapping into it, right? Making everyone feel like they have a voice and they can add value as if they are an owner of your organization. That to me is key and critical. If you're in client service, how do you penetrate new markets, right? How do you develop relationships in different organizations for which you don't have those relationships? Someone else does. But if you continue to recruit like you actually can build a silo around yourself and put your own self out of business, right? Everyone is trying to do the right thing, but we have to realize everything is really a business at the end of the day, whether it's, a school, university, or an actual corporation. Our jobs is really to produce something that someone else is going to consume, and that's what we do. So start there. Innovation, you just want to be different. You want to be a leader. You want to lead in your sector is where I start from.
So I would be tempted to add kind of an anecdote from an experience that I had a few years ago. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, requires public serving organizations to go through the process of developing what's called a transition plan. It's meant to be a comprehensive study and analysis of all of your physical infrastructure, if you're an organization that has any, as well as all your policies and practices that dictate the way you operate, to determine whether or not there are accessibility barriers to the services you provide, to the way that you're impacting people, and by going through that analysis process and identifying those barriers, if and when they exist, you're able to put the organization on a trajectory to fix those accessibility barriers and make the organization more accessible as a whole. So in the transportation space, for one of the divisions within Mass DOT, which is the highway division, so think your roadways, your sidewalks, your rest stops, your park and rides, all that kind of physical infrastructure. One of the key elements of it is curb cuts. The key element of access when you're talking about the roadway network is curb cuts. Can folks with mobility impairments that rely on wheeled mobility devices for their mobility, are they able to traverse the roadway network, sidewalks, and so on by use of these accessible curb cuts? So we as an organization, as the Department of Transportation, we have lots of engineers on staff. We know what it takes to design and build this infrastructure. We have standard plans that every time we build a sidewalk with the curb cut, if it's this shape, this is how we build it. If it's this kind of intersection, this is how we build it. So, applying this kind of ADA accessibility civil rights perspective to it, we could certainly say, okay, we simply need to look at the way we build this infrastructure and determine, is the way we're building it accessible? If not, we can change the way we're building it. And let's get out in the field and figure out if we're building it properly, right? We could do that as an organization. The problem is, if we don't have the perspective, certainly on staff, or at least from kind of a knowledge base about what it means to use that infrastructure across a range of abilities, across a range of perspectives and needs, it might not be the most effective exercise, right? We might come up with a plan that we think is as best as good as it can be, but it's not informed by those kind of diverse perspectives that would really help make a strong end product. So what we did, one of the projects that I worked on several years ago was to say, okay, we know the technical side, we know how we're building, we know the materials that we're using, we know how we design and build this infrastructure. What we don't know is what elements of it actually make it accessible to people, right? We can come up with dozens of measurements that we can take for each one of these curb ramps that we own around the state. We can take measurements until we're blue in the face, but what do we do with that data? And what elements, what aspects of those measurements are the most critical? And so that was really the moment where we said we have to go to the public, to the community of individuals with disabilities and advocates that operate in that space to say, look, we don't know the best approach here. We have to acknowledge that we don't know the best approach here. We want to come up with the most effective product we can, the most effective fix that we can. We need help. So what had started as a team of engineers that lacked that perspective came up with 30 measurements that they thought was critical to access. When we went and met with the community, they said, first of all, thank you for coming to involve us in this discussion. First and foremost, it's good to be at the table, absolutely. And second of all of this other stuff that you're measuring, these 30 points of measurement, we don't need any of that. There's these 8 measurements that are really critical for us as users of this infrastructure to determine whether or not we can get around. Measure these 8, prioritize your fixes based on these 8, and everybody benefits. So we said, okay, that's exactly what we needed to hear. So what that ended up doing was allowing us to go into the field and assess the accessibility based on those 8 points of measurement for 26,000 curb ramps across the state. And we now have a 15-year plan with about a $50 million budget to fix all of them to ensure that they're fully accessible for people with disabilities. And I think that whether you're talking about a hiring perspective or a public impact perspective of an organization, this simple willingness to acknowledge that diversity of perspectives helps produce a better end product, it really just sets you off on the right path right from the beginning.
Thank you. I just want to point out, so as a woman on panels, I've noticed there's only certain poses we can do. I don't know if we basically have to always do this. So I have been practicing catch the football pose. I've been practicing, hey, how you everybody doing poses. I'm trying out all different poses. So no longer
How's
are
that
those,
working out?
hey, I'm comfortable. So I would love to hear from you guys. Any questions for our fabulous panelists?
No, I was asking you to come sit.
Oh. Thought I was being put to work. All right.
I have a question.
My question is this: we are now in the season of sand and salt.
Ooh,
Okay. Now, when it comes to the ADA curb cuts,
yes.
our lovely plows, how do you handle them when it comes to that
Yeah.
factor throughout the entire city? I don't care if you're going to Government Center.
Yeah.
Anywhere, accessibility to the universities, schools, every single place. You also have to consider, you're thinking about wheelchairs and
Mhm.
the motorized ones. Please do not forget about those who have what they call rollerbladers. They operate a whole lot different than the other mechanisms.
Yes. No, absolutely. It's absolutely one of the struggles for MassDOT and for the MBTA, and this idea of coming up with a plan and saying we'll fix a piece of infrastructure and therefore it's fully accessible forever. We know that's not the case. We know that there's ongoing maintenance, there's damage that can occur to it, there's storms, there's all kinds of impacts that can make that piece of infrastructure, that critical piece of infrastructure, unavailable for somebody for a day, a week, a month, whatever it might be. And that certainly goes into our planning in terms of not only managing our own assets, but also the kind of partnerships that we maintain with cities and towns within the service area, with other organizations that partner with the MBTA that are benefiting from the service, using the service, and that's certainly part of the discussion. We actually have at the MBTA an Office of System-Wide Accessibility, and their primary mission is around ensuring fully accessible features of the network to the extent practicable, meaning even if something like a winter storm comes along, let's make sure that there's a plan in place to make sure that we get our key bus routes cleared instantly. Well, snow is still falling. Let's start clearing. Let's get additional routes cleared as soon as the resources become available. Let's make sure that we're being as proactive as we can be.
Did you have a question for us?
Yeah, I have a question for the panel. It's fairly obvious that change in a number of our larger institutions has been negligible over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, the increased number of lawyers, the increased number of docs, the increased number of people in universities, the increased number of people running cultural institutions, those changes have been negligible. And they've been negligible in the face of legal constraints against quotas and against other kinds of incentives to bring about change. Many of the students and a number of the folks who are here are thinking about careers where they would be more entrepreneurial than is the case with the T or with a major global law firm. And I wonder what recommendations you would have for people who are operating more independently in terms of achieving some kind of equitable treatment in the workplace, other than constantly filing lawsuits against people that by and large don't get very far.
That's a great question. I'd have to think about that for a second.
So it's, and I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question. Is it really around? I'm getting it. Is it really around how, when they enter an organization, how do they get the support to be successful? Or is it about entrepreneurs getting access to capital or networks?
I would ask about the entrepreneurs.
So, and that's I think a pretty hot topic. I think everyone's trying to be entrepreneurial and aspirational. I think that there are a couple of avenues. And being an entrepreneur, you need to leverage your network. Am I correct? The entrepreneurs in the room. I think the other piece is leveraging resources of other institutions and organizations and looking at the connections. I find that sometimes we always want to go through the front door, right? We always have the access to go through the front door, but doing business is really relationship driven. And if you, I've never done my genealogy or whatever, but if you kind of do the genealogy in the space for which you're trying to facilitate and grow your business, I would challenge you, encourage, how do you really connect the dots to individuals, organizations, for which it's not the front door, it's actually very much of a back door route, right? I'm not into coding, but there's always a back door, right? Where you can access opportunities and also develop the relationships you need to get people to champion and be the voice for you, right? Our success is always incumbent about people championing, talking about you when you're not in the room. The pitch is nice. The PowerPoint was crazy, right? But it's what happens when you leave the room. Are people still talking about? So I think there's a piece there that is untapped, and there's also a community that's sometimes hard to navigate. So I'm not saying it's easy. I think that's one area. Fair treatment is, I mean, to me, fair treatment in the sense in the entrepreneur is really access and knowing who and what doors to knock on. And I think that's trying to create that pathway of who's who you need to know, and how do you get there from 6 degrees of separation is somewhat, it's rough and rugged, but anyone who I know who's an entrepreneur, that's what they've done, especially as individuals of color. They've had to kind of find other avenues. They've also bought their time. So sometimes it's like being in your space, creating that thing for you, and then figuring out what you really want. So I don't know if I truly answered your question. Gave you kind of a solution and a strategy instead of hitting on that.
May I do a yes and?
Please.
Yes.
Please.
Where to begin? So it turns out the number one demographic that gets venture capital funding is good-looking young white men. So if we think the older companies is gonna, may not do this well, but the younger companies will, no, unfortunately not. And they did test after test, and even if the woman and the man had the same exact pitch, the man still got the venture capital. So, and then the other dilemma is that when you are an entrepreneur of color, a lot of times maybe you're becoming an entrepreneur because you have a great idea, or maybe because you realize I'm not gonna get a fair shake unless I'm my own boss. The other limiting barrier to that is your network doesn't have a lot of capital sometimes. So I remember vividly, 2 months ago, I met with these two gentlemen, both of color, and established, all were senior vice presidents in their previous companies, intelligent, networked, you name it. And we're all sitting down, and one of the gentlemen had this great business idea. And we're like, great, this is great. And then we're like, how can we help you? And we realized we don't have the kind of money to just drop down and say, hey, here's $100,000, or call so-and-so, or we didn't have that. All we had was, how can I help you, that doesn't take money. And I realized how limiting that is. So just two things that you have to kind of keep in mind is who gets the venture capitalists and the fact that sometimes our network doesn't have the capital that we need. But there's hope. Banks like Eastern Bank have specifically created foundations to help Black and brown business owners, specifically for that purpose. There are a lot of mentors of organizations that mentor small businesses of color, etc. But here's 3 principles that I would throw out there for entrepreneurs. leverage your network, grow your network, keep growing it. If you gotta grow it past your social network, you gotta go further than that, because you don't know where that support comes from. Boston is small. We name drop like crazy. And if you gotta know some people to name drop. I mean, sometimes they don't even let you in. They're like, do you know so-and-so? And I go, no. Do you know so-and-so? No. Do you know so-and-so? And then by the fourth time, do you know so? I go, yes. They're like, okay, come on in. It's really, in Boston, like name dropping is a passcode to get into a club. I lie not about that. So expand your network. The second thing I will say is, yes, open those businesses that will be good for society, but also open those businesses that will make you the money and the capital so we can help our network when other people have good ideas. I mean, money is not dirty. We need the money to invest in our network to grow it. I know that's not sexy, but I gotta put it out there because, or else we keep looping, right? So yes, do great in the world, but also make some money. And the third thing I would say is, oh my goodness, let's not fight against each other. Why do we act like we all fight for the scarcity of things? We're like, there's one slot open and we're all going for that, or
Hungry.
right? And I know. What I'm saying is, act like there is plenitude and go for the plenitude. Grow the business, grow the sphere, don't all go after the same 3 businesses. Don't go after the 3, companies all the time. There are thousands and thousands of companies in Massachusetts. I never knew until I got into my own business how many businesses there are, and yet we all fight for the same 10 top companies, right? But there's thousands and thousands of other companies that no one's even touching, that if you say hello, they will be likely to do business with you. So those are my 3 things.
I have a question. So you all said that you didn't like quotas, that it doesn't change the environment, but they've also found that because there aren't quotas, spaces are less diverse than they were when they did have quotas. And even people who are in those spaces now, they're often accused that they're only there because of affirmative action. Harvard Business Journal just did a piece not too long ago of how corporate companies were looking into changing, using diversity and inclusion strategies, whether it's recruiting students and stuff like that. And they were looking at a 5-year plan starting in 2016. 5 years is 2021. How long do I have to wait for diversity and inclusion? So can you just give your perspective of, should we think about quotas again? Is that a more reasonable way to get to diversity a little bit faster?
I have no intention of answering this question, but I want to honor the time because Bonnard has a flight to catch. So it's 7:58.
I have about 10 more minutes.
So if you want,
You
maybe
wanna
you
go
want to
first?
start us off.
What was the question again?
Quotas. Should they come back?
We came back. Why are we here? Again, I have a thing about quotas, and I get why they were instituted, and I get where the impact is. Where we are in this conversation around diversity and inclusion, going back to quotas, really may start a different kind of conversation, right? Because it goes back to the earlier question around reverse racism, win-loss. And it also may put, a stamp on the individuals who are very talented for the role, but now you were just a part of this special class instead of that you were a member of this class. So there are things that we may bring up based on where we are in the diversity journey that I think we need to really force in institutions. One of the things that we're doing is what you talked about, we have action plans. Each of our business units, they identify their goals, and we are holding them accountable for their goals. We didn't force, each business unit to focus on what we want them to focus on. We want to empower them to focus on what is valuable to them, and we will grow from there. Again, this is still the third rail conversation. People care, but people care about a lot of things. We need action, and so we need you to at least ride the bike, then we can take off the training wheels, then we can give you some gears, and we can really get things moving. It's an iterative process, and it does take time. And a lot of research will say change management does take 3 to 5 years for it to stick, be embedded, and show its results. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, last question.
Based on your opinion, guys, what are some of the creative ways we can proactively source candidates from underrepresented communities? And how do we go about launching and growing employee resource groups? Is it
how do you source from underrepresented communities
yes,
and launch employee resource groups?
Yeah. Do they organically form, or is it HR's duty to
Yeah.
do it?
So, I'll take the second part first, the employee resource groups. So, from my perspective, and from my experience, from what I've seen at Mass DOT and at the MBTA, the most successful employee resource groups and the longest lasting employee resource groups are the ones that have this kind of critical mass and fervor kind of at a grassroots level among employees to get together and to let management know, let senior leadership know about the kind of issues in the workplace that are impacting them as a particular demographic of employees, whatever that might be. So I think that there's an obligation on HR, there's an obligation on the employer to create, to foster an environment where ERGs, employee resource groups, can thrive. But I think there's absolutely, the flip side of that is, of course, this, enthusiasm among the staff to participate in those groups. It's easy for that enthusiasm to be lost, especially when there's obstacles encountered along the way. Whether it's the formation of a new employee resource group and you're trying to carve out a new space where there might be kind of strong, established, embedded groups that are already filling a critical role, and they're tied into the big picture of the organization in a really meaningful way, and then a new group comes along and they don't necessarily have that same level of influence or connectivity to the rest of the operation. So there is a need for some kind of, I would say, for some persistence, understanding that it is kind of an uphill battle to get one of these groups started, but also certainly looking for partnerships, looking for collaborative kind of opportunities to say, we know that we're a new resource, kind of new to in the kind of full profile of this organization, but we have something to offer. Here's the kind of unique element of what it is that we're going to bring to the employee culture, the employee workforce, the kind of work dynamic for that organization. And remember the first part of the question?
The
Creative
second part, what are some of the creative ways that you think we can recruit or source candidates from underrepresented communities?
Yeah. So honestly, one of the areas that I've been trying to kind of peel back the layers on and build stronger relationships with personally, from a professional perspective, but it's kind of work that I've been doing recently, has been identifying kind of vibrant, effective professional organizations of people in different fields. And it doesn't just necessarily have to be highly trained professionals in any given industry or any given field, but certainly just collectives of individuals who bring certain skills to the table as possible employees. The kind of visibility that this kind of professional organization could bring to that talent pool is huge. If an organization like that is able to say, we're here, we represent this community, we exist, and we have talent at your disposal, and all you need to do is reach out to us, and we can fill the pool of candidates just from our one organization. That goes a long way, because as was mentioned, with recruiting being kind of a passive activity, there isn't always this search for the new organizations that are representing new interests or individuals that hadn't necessarily been represented before. So being able to kind of collectivize within the community and being able to essentially just let these employers know that these groups exist kind of knock down the door a little bit, to just let them know, we're here, we want to know when these opportunities exist. It can go a long way.
Can I just add to that? I would start with the already established organizations that are here. And I'm assuming you're looking in Boston. There are a ton of nonprofits that are skilling up underrepresented youth in this city. There are a lot of relationships that are established, and they're always looking to potentially place the kids or the young folks that they're working with in organizations. I think it sounds like it's gonna be a business opportunity. It sounds like there's a gap between understanding who's out in the marketplace to help you fill the need, right? And so one thing, if there's a way you can do it, a lot of the corporations here have relationships, and they're posting them on their websites with organizations that they support, right? Posse is one that comes to mind. There's Bill, there's Inroads, we can go on and on and on, right? So they exist. It's trying to figure out how do you potentially kind of build a collective list and approach them and let them know what you're looking for. Because I'm sure they're hungry. If they can get one person or two people placed, they will be very happy. So there's a need that they've created. They're creating, able to fill the void. You have the need, and there's a dating app of some sort that needs to be created to bring it all together. And then on the ERG piece, if you're talking about starting an ERG in an organization that doesn't have any, right? I think we have to start with the why and whether the organization is ready for an ERG, or are they just ready to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion? Because the ERG is opening something different, and if you don't have the infrastructure to support, to champion, to actually receive the tension within the organization and then do something about it, you're gonna create some more pain. So I would start with understanding why, bring some guest speakers or whatever to facilitate that conversation, some other affiliated organizations, so that you're not alone and your organization is not put in a position where they now have to defend something. Unless they're really, really ready to have the conversation, they've done some of the data analysis. So start with the why, and then you build from there. And that's the best way to go that will allow it to be successful and have stickiness.
Thank you very much. Thank you.